ESimple channel.
English for all. Learning and exploring together.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the second episode of our podcast. We're Adam and Hana, and we're so happy to finally be here. In today's episode, we're going to talk about tea, China, and its evolution into a wonderful beverage. So grab a cup of tea, settle in, and let's get started.
Let's really, take a journey through history, culture, global impact, and all this, sparked by just this single plant.
Yeah, it is interesting that you say, one plant, because that's often how this whole story starts. The legend of Shennong, the divine farmer, it credits him with discovering tea, but it's probably more of a reflection of how deeply tea is ingrained in Chinese culture, than an actual historical account.
So you're saying this legend that we've all heard about where Shennong accidentally poisons himself 72 times in a row while foraging, and then a tea leaf magically, brings him back to life. It's a little bit far-fetched.
Well, tea doesn't cure all poisons.
Yeah.
But it does highlight how revered tea was in ancient China. Archaeological evidence shows that tea was cultivated in China like 6,000 years ago. What's really fascinating, though, is that initially tea wasn't even a beverage.
Wait, what? So they didn't brew it? What did they do with it?
They consumed it as food. They often mixed it with grains to make porridge. Can you imagine having tea in your oatmeal?
Wow. Yeah, that's not how I usually start my day.
Right. It wasn't until about 1,500 years ago that this method of, steeping the leaves in really hot water emerged. And that's how we started to extract these complex flavors that we now associate with tea.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've always wondered about those really elaborate tea ceremonies. Did those start, right after they discovered steeping?
Not quite, no. There were actually centuries of experimentation involved. One significant development was matcha, which we know today as matcha, and this was like a total game changer. They would heat tea leaves, they'd press them, grind them into powder, and then they'd whisk it all with hot water. And it became this very refined art form.
So those intricate designs that you see in tea foam, like latte art but with tea, that all stems from that early matcha preparation.
Exactly. Matcha became a really important part of Chinese culture. You can imagine emperors sipping it, poets finding inspiration from the aroma artists creating those beautiful designs you just mentioned. And this vibrant tea culture, it really set the stage for tea's journey across the entire globe.
I've always heard about Japanese tea ceremonies, but I never realized that they originated in China.
Well, they evolved independently, but it was a Japanese monk who brought tea plants from China over to Japan sometime during the 9th century. And from there, the Japanese developed their own unique rituals and traditions around tea, which, those are fascinating in their own right. Then back in the 14th century, under the Ming Dynasty, there was a shift from that cake-pressed tea to loose-leaf tea.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So tea was first eaten as food, then they brewed it into matcha, they pressed it into cakes, and then eventually it became loose-leaf tea. And all this was before it even left China.
And that's just the beginning, really. Think about it. All of this happened before tea even reached Europe. And its arrival in the West, that's a whole other chapter filled with all sorts of interesting figures, a lot of competition, and even global conflict.
Yeah, it really is amazing how tea went from just something people were curious about to this commodity that everybody wanted. Like, it was driving global trade. It even shaped history.
I know, right? It's wild. We think of tea as this calming drink.
Yeah.
But you mentioned conflict. How does a plant like tea lead to actual conflict?
But think about the 17th century when those Dutch traders brought tea over to Europe, in big amounts,
Yeah.
It opened up this whole new market,
Right.
and the demand, it just exploded.
Right, and this was around the time when that Portuguese noblewoman, Catherine of Braganza, she married King Charles II of England, right? And she was a big tea drinker. Exactly. She's often called the tea queen because she made tea fashionable among the English aristocracy. And remember, this was also when Great Britain was becoming, a global power. As their empire grew, so did the world's thirst for tea.
Okay, I can see how that would create some tension, especially with China having a monopoly on tea plants for so long.
For sure. By 1700, tea was selling in Europe for 10 times the price of coffee. The competition to get it was fierce. Those clipper ships, the really sleek, fast ones, they were designed specifically for the tea trade. Each company wanted to be the first to bring that cargo back to Europe to get those profits.
So it's like a maritime version of the gold rush.
Yeah.
But with tea instead of gold.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. But this huge demand for tea, it led to some pretty serious consequences. At first, Britain was paying for all of this tea with silver, but that, wasn't really sustainable, so they turned to another commodity, opium.
Oh, wow. So Britain's solution to their trade imbalance ended up fueling, like, an opium crisis in China.
It's a really sad part of history. In 1839, a Chinese official, he was fed up with Britain's influence, and he ordered the destruction of this massive shipment of British opium. And that single act, it ignited the First Opium War.
It's hard to believe that an actual war was fought, at least in part, over tea. Didn't this war have lasting consequences for China?
It did, yeah. The war went on for years, and China was defeated in 1842, and they were forced to cede Hong Kong to the British, and they had to accept these, like, really unfavorable trade terms. It weakened China's global position for over a century.
So even after losing the war, China still controlled tea production. That's where Robert Fortune comes in, right? The botanist who was hired to basically steal tea plants from China.
Yeah, exactly. The British East India Company, they were desperate to, like, control the tea market. So they hired Robert Fortune to go undercover. He disguised himself, and he smuggled tea plants and skilled workers out of China and brought them to Darjeeling, India.
Wow, that's like a real-life botanical espionage thriller. His mission pretty much break China's monopoly on tea, right?
It did. And it paved the way for, the global tea production that we know today. From a closely guarded secret to a global phenomenon, tea's journey was definitely not simple.
It's fascinating to see how all of these historical events, how they shaped the tea industry. But I'm also curious about how this one plant, how it's been, like, incorporated into different cultures around the world.
That's where things get really interesting. Even though it all comes from the same plant, the ways that we prepare and enjoy tea are so different across cultures. From elaborate rituals to everyday staples, tea has become a part of societies all over the world.
It really is amazing to think about all those different cultural variations. You mentioned everything from, like, rituals to everyday staples. What are some of the most striking examples of how tea is woven into, different cultures around the world?
Well, we talked about Japanese tea ceremonies a little bit earlier, but there's just so much to them. They really embody this Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, which is all about finding beauty in imperfection, in things that don't last.
Oh, wow. So it's not even just about, like, drinking the tea. It's a whole philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. And then on the other hand, you have something like Turkish rise tea. It's super popular in Turkey. They brew it strong and sweet in these special double-stacked teapots called saygınlık, and it's served in these small tulip-shaped glasses. And offering tea to guests, it's like a core part of Turkish hospitality.
So you see all these really different brewing methods and serving styles all based on the culture. What about, like, the types of tea that people drink? We've talked a lot about black tea, but there are so many other varieties out there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Green tea, white tea, oolong, pure. It just goes on and on. And each type has its own unique flavor. And even, like, purported health benefits, matcha, for example, which we talked about earlier, it's really prized for its antioxidants.
Wow, it's incredible how one plant can have so much variety. What about those everyday staples that you mentioned? Any examples that come to mind?
Well, think about Tibetan butter tea. It's actually a savory drink. It's made with yak butter, salt, and tea leaves.
Huh, that sounds pretty unusual.
It does, right? But it's a staple in the high altitudes of the Himalayas. It provides warmth and energy, which you really need in that kind of environment.
It's amazing how all these cultures, they've taken this one simple leaf and they've created so many unique traditions and flavors. From those really elaborate ceremonies to those everyday rituals, tea has become, like, an important part of life for so many people.
It really shows the power of tea, It crosses borders, it brings people together, it gives us a moment of peace in our busy lives.
You've given me a whole new appreciation for that cup of tea that I have every morning. It's not just a drink, it's like a journey through history, culture, tradition.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's a whole world of tea out there just waiting to be explored. So many varieties, different brewing methods, and cultural traditions to discover.
It makes you wonder what other things that we see every day have these really interesting stories behind them. So to our listeners, the next time you have a cup of tea, just think about the journey it took to get to you, the cultures it represents, and the connections it helps to create. Keep exploring and keep those deep dives going.